got it, Jeff? Or?
Yeah, I had to quit and rejoin.
Okay, cool.
So I'm going to go over this briefly. I've actually got about 40 slides here, but I'm not going to subject everybody to that tonight. But what I wanted to talk a bit about is sort of like where we've come in the last year, a little bit about like what's happening and where we're headed with the leadership retreat that just happened this past January, and then kind of our major direction for the year. At some point, we will do a more in-depth version. What's that?
Can you hear us?
Audio in Juno.
You just have a spotty connection.
Okay.
1 second here.
Just carry on.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah, it's on our end. Go ahead and keep presenting.
Okay, so anyways, yeah, we'll do a more in-depth version, but really we're sort of compiling all this data, and then also we did our big developer survey in 2019, and so we're kind of just looking at what's changed over the last year since we started the Alliance in 2018. So just like some big talking points and like what's happened in 2019. So we wrote the white paper, we expanded to Juno and Fairbanks. We ended up with, we 3x'd in size. We went from 100 people to 300 people. We had 10 meetups, 1 boot camp, 1 hackathon. Our hackathon had 71 participants, which was super fun. Wow. Yeah, we filled rooms. Most of those were UAF students, which was really cool to see. And then we secured $60,000 in funding for the next 5 years, well, 4 years now. And then also we formed an official board. So we went from, buying pizza in a room to like a real governing body, which has been pretty cool. And this is important because unless we do these things and we have more people participate and kind of put their own spin and flavor on things, then it will always be like one person's baby, and unfortunately it won't survive secession. And so that was really one of the core goals of building the Alaska Developers Alliance from day one, was that we want to make it sustainable. We want to have an overarching organization that's going to live and not die when somebody's life gets busy. And so we're doing a great job doing that. We have, as I said, we've got like 10 people on the board now. And so we're getting a lot of great input, and I'll dive into a little bit more on that in just a second. So yeah, we can just look at some basic Slack statistics. I grabbed this just from our hackathon in 2019, just because it did a really good job of kind of illustrating our growth over time, which was from October 24th, 2017 to July 2018. This Slack channel was actually the Fairbanks developer group. And then when we joined forces with them, we changed it to be the Dev Alliance, and then had a big spike, and we've seen steady growth there. So that's pretty cool. And then just our all-time messaging over the last year has kind of followed that same trend. We had a massive boom going into October, and then of course it slows down a little bit more for the holidays. So moving forward onto the developer survey, just some totals. So we had 113 people respond out of about 300 at the time that we closed the survey. So that was 37%, which is not bad. Our open rate for our monthly newsletter is about 45 to 50%, but not all of those people are programmers. So we do have a blend of people who participate in Slack, but don't follow, but don't subscribe to the mailing list. But that's been pretty cool, because a lot of people outside of the Developers Alliance find out what we're doing because of the mailing list, but most of our participants are engaging with us via Slack. So that kind of explains that split there. So some of our like big kind of questions that we're trying to ask and understand more of are, what's the job market like in Alaska? And I think some of us know this more than others, but it's not great. The ones that exist tend to be less interesting. But as I'll get into in just a minute, some of this comes down to our core demographic that's represented within the Developers Alliance, and that was actually fascinating. So I'm going to keep going in the survey, and then I'll get into reasons why this survey is maybe not as accurate as it could be in the near future. So the next thing is who our typical Alaska Developer Alliance member is. They live in Anchorage. They have an undergrad degree. They're currently employed as a lead or senior engineer for an Alaskan company. They got into programming because it's challenging and fun. They use JavaScript or Python. That one was absolutely surprising for me. They've been to less than 5 meetings and are interested in participating more, and they do not have kids. This is fascinating to me because more of the people who took this survey are not participating in our group in person than the people who are actually showing up. And so I had like a pretty good idea of, who are the people who are showing up, who makes up the majority of that 300, but the majority of our participants of that survey are not falling into that demographic. So that's pretty interesting. And when I say the majority of these people, right, obviously we have a large constituency of students and professionals, but there's sort of a duality of like who's showing up and participating in person versus participating in general in other ways, whether that's Slack or following along on the mailing list. So the other big thing was, how are we doing overall? And that was pretty cool because we got generally positive remarks, and we also asked about what are some things that we could do better. So better at communication and expanding our reach to beginners, kids, non-programmer audiences, and I'll dive more into that in a second. But also it's been interesting how quickly the community has grown, because a lot of people didn't believe that there were that many programmers in Alaska. And so overall we're doing a good job, but we could definitely improve. So I'm going to skip pretty quickly through some of these other bullet points. Most people have been to 1 to 5 meetings. It seems like the people who are really participating are fairly devoted, right? The ones who we're seeing at most of the meetups is actually only about 13%, which is kind of surprising. And then a handful of us have been to all of them. So probably about 15% of people are going regularly. 30% have not been at all, which is, again, kind of falls in line with the surprising demographics that we're seeing. The majority of people are attending meetups as opposed to anything else, but a decent chunk of those people could probably be explained by students who joined in the hackathon, or people who went to the GoLang bootcamp. So are you currently employed as a programmer? We're seeing some of these statistics change from 2018. So unemployed is up 3%, but employed is also up 1.3%, which is kind of an interesting statistic. But because of the way we broke this up, my understanding is that people are shifting from self-identifying as a hobbyist to identifying as a professional. And so more people of this total pie are looking for employment in some fashion. And so that's why we're seeing some of these numbers change. Do you work for an Alaskan company? We actually dropped 5%. For employed locally. And my hunch here is that we've acquired like a lot more remote developers who are coming from more vibrant, engaged ecosystems, who are like coming to Alaska, moving here for family or other reasons, and then getting engaged in the Developers Alliance. And that's one of the shifts. This question in 2018, I think we had maybe 50 responses. And I would need to double check on how many we got, but how many?
It says at the top corner. It says 95.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, so we had 95. So we had close to double for this year. But that's pretty interesting because 30+% are working remotely from our community.
So people have recently moved here and gotten programming jobs?
No. So
okay.
So I represent that. No, I moved here. I had a job and I moved here. I was remote before, and I moved here, and then I'm still remote.
But same job?
It was the same job, yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's sort of an interesting trend that we're seeing. Our people with job mobility are moving here, and they're looking for local opportunities. But unfortunately, the pay scale and job market, if you have a specialty that's sought after in the lower 48, is really hard to come by here. Most of the jobs tend to be in corporate enterprise, web development in some fashion. And if you specialize in something like graph databases like Dave, there's almost no opportunity for that specialty here,
Right.
which makes things difficult.
Yes.
This was, we probably could have guessed, but the majority of employment, which is about 50%, is telco, oil and gas, university, and government. If you are a programmer, how long did it take you to find your first job? 6 months to a year was up 2.6%. Less than a month is down. This doesn't really surprise me. Anecdotally, talking to people through the community, I've seen a lot more early stage programmers looking for jobs, and it seems like that's a little bit more difficult, but within a year it's easier to find something. It's just that the hiring process is maybe taking a little bit longer. Some of that could be attributed to the university hiring freeze and other things that we're seeing. 46% of our constituents and people participating would identify as not senior or junior to mid-level, which I think is pretty interesting. I would be curious sort of this pie, how many people are participating at regular meetups. The levels.fyi is an awesome website. If you guys haven't seen it, check it out. It's kind of a good way to rank yourself on where you're at as a programmer. Be aware that imposter syndrome can also play a role in some of this stuff, but that gives you some good guidelines on how to rank yourself as a programmer.
Also, there's 7 apparently Carmack Wozniaks. That's
I should dive into those. I'd be very curious who self-identifies as John Carmack or Woz. Most of our people are in Anchorage and Fairbanks, which is pretty well known and understood. But we are starting to look at what would it look like to create some better, more cohesive engagement. And so, in really small towns, whether that's, say, Valdez or Kodiak, right, could we create a remote chapter that would be better to engage? And with that idea, there's also kind of been this funny inside joke for those people who have been participating with the Developers Alliance for a long time. Conroy Whitney, who I'm going to give a shout out to right now, he's on vacation traveling around the globe. And there was sort of this funny point where he was looking at potentially leaving the state, and I was like, well, am I still part of the Alaska Developers Alliance? And I was making a joke that, well, it's like the Hotel California. Like, you could join the alliance, but you can never leave. So we really want to kind of look into this. What does it look like if we could create a remote chapter and create this as, a community you can participate in regardless of where you are? And I think that's an interesting idea we can explore a little bit further. I already kind of touched on this. Majority of people are programming in JavaScript or Python. I'd be really curious in understanding
JavaScript or Java?
JavaScript.
Okay.
And I'd be really curious in understanding where those people who are primarily programming in Python are located. Like what industry? Are you in oil and gas or telco? Because the state and in general, most large corporate organizations in Alaska are Java and C#. So, or at least they were as of 5 years ago. So that would be interesting to kind of bridge that gap and also overlay that on kind of where people are at and what demographics are fitting into that. So
is that the actual question?
Yes.
Because point of view. When I read that, that might be my personal choice of my primary programming language, not what I do at work.
So there are 2 questions. What languages do you use for work is the next one. And sorry, this is a bit small. I don't know if everybody's able to read it, but Java at the top is 18%, C# is 21%, JavaScript is the number 1 with 53%, and Python is number 2 with 52%. So yeah, I mean, to me these numbers are a bit surprising, and it'd be again, interesting to kind of, like, we have this all in Excel, so we can do some data mining if anybody wants to step up to the plate and kind of dive into this stuff, so we can figure out, like, okay, are the people who are doing JavaScript and Python, are they part of those 30% that are remote, and then only, 15% of those people are doing it within the state, and then, who are the Java and C# people, and, what demographic do they belong to? I think some of that would be worthwhile diving into.
I knew someone at GCI and he used Python.
Really?
That was his primary, yeah. I mean, he did some other stuff too, but.
Oil and gas is using a lot of Python too.
Yeah. Obviously, like most people, most programmers I've met are not satisfied with job opportunities in Alaska. We've known this. This trend didn't really change from last year. Some interesting things to note, though, are that people who ranked that we were 4s and 5s, which is better, or great job opportunities, that actually improved 4%. But the people who said, like, the jobs are okay, or the jobs kind of suck, that actually pooled into, they suck less, right? Like a 2 out of 5 increase. So that's a really interesting thing. So it's like people are sort of stuck in, like, doing what they're doing is either okay, or it's, slightly better than I'm not stoked on it. But still, we have very few opportunities that people are excited about. In terms of which continuing education people are excited about, this was really surprising to me. Most people were excited for our monthly meetups. We had an increase of like 16% over last year. And so I'd be curious in knowing, like, is that 16% increase because over time we've seen, like, we've had really high quality speakers for our meetups, or is that sort of just like a who is able to make, the hackathon or the boot camps? So that's pretty interesting and intriguing. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more. I think another thing I'm going to get into with some of the demographics is, like, who we're actually reaching, because our meetups are, Thursday nights at 7 p.m. So where do you hang out with programmers outside of work? This is a great one. So in 2018, what other programmers, being the response is actually down 8.5%. But at the same time, our AK developers Alliance events are up 8.2. So that almost accounts for all of it, right? Like, that's pretty cool. So our major takeaways are that we're your best friends.
Well, no, we've now met other programmers. It's like,
Totally. Yeah, so I'll take that. What would you be most interested in learning at a retreat? This was really interesting. I didn't dive too deeply into this, but what I did see happen was that there were a few that were, like, off the charts, like up in the 60s and 70s%. And what really happened is none of those top ones really changed that much, but they all flattened out. And so I don't know if that's because the demographics of the group changed, and therefore people are not necessarily like, I gotta go AR, VR, or whatever. But it seems like we're sort of more evenly distributed among those, technologies people are already interested in learning. The one that still kind of boggles my mind is that COBOL got 5.6%. And maybe those people just want to make a ton of money, and I support that. That's super cool. I'm going to skip over the cloud services, but what do you believe is the most important element missing in the developer community? Number 1, more jobs. Number 2, more community and company participation. 3 is stable training and university funding. I think that's pretty similar to what it had last year. What are we doing right? Cultivating community and outreach, interesting events and speakers, leadership consistency and planning. That was awesome to see, because those people in leadership work pretty darn hard to make that happen. So yeah, in general, most people rated 42% said we're doing amazing, 35% said we're doing pretty good, and 22% were neutral. We're just going to assume those are the people who haven't been yet.
Nobody said awful.
Nobody said awful.
And only
Nobody said
one
awful.
said the other one, whatever one.
What's that?
Only one said the number 2.
Yeah, we're just going to assume he was trolling.
Yeah.
Jinx on.
So what could we do better? The number one thing was more engagement and better event communication. I think that makes perfect sense. And then expanding the reach beyond developers. Event technical difficulties. So that one is actually totally addressed. That's why we're all at universities now. And this seems to be like pretty great across the board, which is like now we don't have AV issues, and Arsh is absolutely crushing the streaming. So thank you, Arsh. What could make the tech community better in Alaska? Number one thing, more and different job opportunities, and then better community. So we had our first ever leadership retreat in January. We got everybody who's been participating, original founders, people from Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Juneau. We all went up to Fairbanks and we got together for the weekend. And the reason that we did this was that it got to a point where like we started this group and it was just a tight-knit group of us. And we sort of had all these initiatives with the newsletter and the meetups and getting pizza and then starting to try and bring people in and outreach and talking to students at universities. And we just realized we had a lot of initiatives. And so we started bringing people into the fold and getting more people to participate in leadership. And once we had funding, we sort of had to solidify some of those roles. But what was essentially happening is that because we hadn't identified what our core sort of vision and goals were for the organization, it was sort of like a really small group of that leadership kind of knew what was going on and what should be done. And like other people weren't really empowered. And so, it was like those one or two or three people who knew what was going on were really having to kind of be on every single event, which is exhausting if you're trying to maintain a job and a family or be a student. And so we decided to get everybody together so that we could really flesh those things out. And what you're seeing in this large photo is where we started to really like brainstorm and break down these things of why we're doing this and how we're here and what we're actually doing to accomplish those things. And it was fascinating to see all of the different answers that we had from those 10 people who came up for the leadership retreat. But they were pretty vastly different across the board. Everybody had different kind of spins and what they were doing and why they were participating. A lot of it came down to finding sort of a tribe and a people to group and participate and identify with. And so that was really cool to see that deeper need of like finding your people and sense of belonging was something that was an underlying fundamental value of what the Developers Alliance was about. So leading into that, one of our hard things to figure out was who is the Developers Alliance for? And at a high level, it's easy to say, well, obviously it's for developers. But one of the things that came up within our group when we were trying to come up with a label for who it really was for was, is it for students? Is it for software creators? Is it for technical professionals, right? Like, where are the lines for all of those different things? And there was, the startup community was pretty heavily represented in the board, as well as the sort of enterprise and corporate community. And what we found was that as we were toying around with, phrases that we were thinking would sort of catch all of these, like the enterprise people who are maybe software architects or database administrators did not identify as developers. And at the same time, the software creators, right, does not necessarily include entrepreneurs and people who want to start technology companies. And so we kind of got into the weeds of that for about 2.5 hours until we finally landed on the Developers Alliance being for software professionals. And that was really an impactful thing for us to figure out, because once we understood that was our core constituency, we start to understand who are the stakeholders among software professionals, right? They're students who are aspiring to be professionals, and people who are maybe hobbyists who are aspiring to get paid as developers, or maybe they just do it as a hobby, but they want to be around professional developers and have that knowledge exchange. But that also goes on to talk to corporate, right? So the GCIs, the ConocoPhillips, the state of Alaska, they need to be connected to talent somehow. And it's really difficult and intimidating as a student to kind of bridge that gap and just like walk in and hand in a resume. And so really what we can do as the Developers Alliance is bridge that gap for all of those different demographics. And so getting into that, right, understanding more about, you know, who we're currently serving has been really interesting, because we identified a few underlying problems that we're working to get better at and fix as an organization. So the number one is that the majority of programmers in the state are actually employed by telco, healthcare, oil and gas, and the state. That is the smallest demographic of participation currently of the Developers Alliance of 330 people. So I see that as a massive opportunity in that, like, we're a thriving community and we haven't even tapped the largest population of programmers in the state. So who are our current participating constituents and demographics? Well, they're professionals with no kids between the ages of 25 and 45. That looks a lot like me. Which makes perfect sense, right? I was the one who was sending out the original newsletters and organizing with people and students up in Fairbanks and Vince and Arsh, and so it kind of makes sense, right? Like, we created this sort of for us by us, and that's who it's been marketed to, and that's where our events are 7 p.m. on a Thursday, and it makes perfect sense that somebody with kids would not be able to participate because they're going to, you know, maybe go home and eat dinner, or maybe it doesn't make sense to go home, but either way, if they come at 7 p.m., they may not see their kids and be able to put them to bed at night, right? Like, that's a pretty big hit for a weekday night. So the majority of our participation are mid to senior level developers between the ages of 24 and 45. Then next is students, aspiring professionals, corporate organizations who we have almost no engagement with, and remote organizations, which actually they should probably be a little bit higher in there. So the next is really understanding who and why we're marketing to each of those demographics. So within this, right, like we you know, sort of have like a broad messaging, but unfortunately that messaging does not necessarily speak to each of those demographics. So students don't necessarily know, why should I be participating in the Developers Alliance? And this came up recently because students in Fairbanks, their week does not end on Thursdays like it does in the University of Alaska Anchorage. And so for them, they could be doing homework as opposed to showing up and participating on a Thursday night when they've got class on Friday. So that's one thing that was positive that came out of this. The second, you know, professionals without kids. Well, raise your hand, right? That's probably the majority of the room here tonight. Professionals with kids looks cool, but 7 p.m. on a weekday, probably not going to happen very often. Thank you, Jeremy, for showing up and showing off your Minecraft mods. And then entrepreneurs in the surrounding ecosystem, right? They're not developers. They might be designers. They might be people who are interested in starting companies. They might be companies with existing businesses that need software and projects built. They would have no reason to come and contact us. And so that's another demographic that we can target and build messages around to be welcoming within the community. You know, major takeaways. You know, we can better serve students with better partnerships to corporate by creating a more holistic ecosystem. By getting connected with corporate, we can get students jobs and employed a lot easier, which gives them an incentive to participate with us. And then we can also turn around and show that value to them, which and create messaging for them so they know why they're coming to participate. The other you know, big things is that really I think just continuing to grow is our number one focus, and also continue to distribute the workload of leadership by either growing the board, making it easier for people who maybe have little spurts of time but don't necessarily have time to dedicate to a full board position. But the more people that we can get participating in the Alliance, the more opportunity is going to be created, because as people find it easier to get jobs, then more people are going to, you know, try ideas and build side projects and meet other people within the community, and those can turn into businesses. So kind of the bottom line of all of this is that creating a more inclusive ecosystem of students, developers, corporations leads to more companies more jobs and more opportunity. So that's really where we're headed for 2020. You know, we're not a closed group. We post all of our board meetings online. They're also on the YouTube channel. And if you're interested in getting in touch with leadership or participating more, there's a Leadership 2020 on Slack, and just feel free to ping any of us in leadership. And then the other thing is, if you have any connections with, you know, oil and gas, telco, hospitals, the state of Alaska, we'd really love to make those so we can start to close that loop. So yeah, does anybody have any questions or comments? Yeah.
So, I mean,
A little louder.
you consistently asked people to fill out the survey,
Yeah.
and I never understood. Am I supposed to fill that out more than once?
No, so the reason.
Like, make sure you fill this out. I'm like,
That's why.
Yeah. So the reason
how do you
is
know those are all unique submissions?
because we forced you to put in your email. So.
Oh, okay.
So yeah,
I
it's
couldn't remember.
yeah, exactly. And I think that happened to a lot of people. That survey was open for like 8 months or something from the first time we sent it out. This next year, we're going to do a better job of like putting a time window on it. So it might be, you know, from the time we do the boot camp until the end of the hackathon or something. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have that a little better arranged, and
Yeah.
we'll also give a little bit of background as to why we want you to fill out the survey for these sorts of metrics.
Yeah. The other thing is, you know, like it's sort of for me, it was really bizarre to see that. You know, I started talking with some community-oriented organizations, Launch Alaska, right, who's our primary benefactor. They're our main sponsor of the $12,000 a year. And for me, it was like pretty surreal to see that, like, we wrote a draft of the white paper, and then we buttoned it up, and then we passed it out, and then we got $60,000 funding. And so, like, a big piece of the reason that we do this survey is the more that we can understand our developer community, the more we can take that information to corporate and organizations who will give us money to create a better ecosystem and provide more boot camps and more perks for the community. Yeah.
Yeah, and if anybody wants access to the actual data, the underlying data, let me know, and I can give you access.
Yeah, we'll sanitize the emails
Yeah,
out
I
of
was
it,
saying,
but
that's the
otherwise,
one thing,
yeah,
yeah.
the data is totally up for grabs if anybody wants to study it. Any questions in Juneau or Fairbanks? Cool. All right, guys. Well, last thing. Oh, was that somebody in Fairbanks?
Not us.
It was just
Okay.
feedback.
Did you wanna pull somebody at random, Dave, for the JetBrains IDE
Oh, from
from Slack? And by at random, I mean if you choose a number between 1 and 16, I will select that person from the Slack list, and they get a JetBrains IDE license.
7.
7. All right. So that would be Chip M from Kenai. Cool. So somebody from Kenai won a JetBrains IDE license. All right. Very cool. All right. Thanks, guys, for joining us tonight. You know, I think there's usually a small contingency from each location that, or at least Anchorage, we wander over to the Blue Fox. I think some people in Fairbanks head over to the pub. But yeah, look forward to seeing you guys and hanging out. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you for sacrificing the charge of your laptop. What's the final